Welcome to creepy darkness. Imagine moving into a quiet, old house, only to find that you're not alone. Mark came looking for peace, but what he found was Julia, a spirit bound by tragedy, betrayal, and unfinished business. As shadows move and whispers fill the air, Mark is pulled deeper into her story. Can he help Julia find peace? Or will he too be trapped by her haunting past? Stay tuned, hit like, and subscribe to join us on this eerie journey, only on Creepy Darkness. Mark is a man in his 30s who has just experienced a change in his life. After breaking up with his long-term relationship of nearly a decade and losing his job for a short time, Mark decided to leave the city where he had been attached to for many years to seek a change. Loneliness and pressure made him want to try living in a quieter place. Mark found a rented house in an old residential area, a few hours' drive away from the city, where the pace of life was slower and less noisy. The house was at the end of a deserted road, with a small garden in front and rows of dense trees surrounding it, adding to the mysterious and gloomy atmosphere at night. The rent was so cheap that Mark was a bit skeptical, but the landlord just shrugged and said that few people would dare to rent it because of its remote location. Although the house actually looked quite sturdy, thinking that this could be a new start, Mark decided to move in, despite the eerie silence that surrounded the house. As soon as he entered, Mark felt a strange chill, even though it was quite hot outside. The house had a classic architectural style with wooden walls and high ceilings. The interior was simply furnished with a few old items, but the dark corners of the house seemed deeper than usual, as if they were hiding something. The rooms were a bit old, with faint scratches on the walls. It seemed that many people had come and gone, leaving their traces. In the bedroom, Mark found a faded painting hanging on the wall, depicting a young girl sitting by the window, her face sad and her eyes staring at him. The first night, Mark felt a little uneasy. The surrounding space was too quiet, making him feel like all sounds were swallowed up in an incomprehensible emptiness. Only the creaking of the wooden floor every time he moved was the only sign of his existence here. A few days passed. Mark began to get used to his new life. However, strange things quickly appeared. At first, they were just small events, almost easy to ignore. Mark began to notice that some objects were not in the place he remembered putting them. Sometimes, he heard whispers, very soft, as if from a faraway place. But when he turned his head, everything was silent as if nothing had happened. One night, when Mark was about to turn off the light to go to bed, he caught a glimpse of someone's shadow passing by the mirror in the corner of the room. He panicked and turned on the light and checked the room, but found nothing. Mark tried to reassure himself that it was just a hallucination due to his fatigue, but the creepy feeling did not go away. By the 7th day here, Mark began to have nightmares. Strange dreams kept coming, about a young girl standing in the middle of a dark room, her face full of fear and despair. She tried to say something to Mark, but the sound seemed to be muffled, only weak mumbles. In a dream, Mark also saw the girl being dragged through the hallway, her hands clutching the floor, leaving long bloodstains. After waking up, Mark felt his heart pounding and sweat pouring down, but what surprised him the most was seeing faint, long streaks on the floor. Just like in his dream, he didn't even dare to check what those streaks were, just hurriedly wiping them off and telling himself that they were his footprints that he had accidentally made. Feeling uneasy, Mark decided to ask a few neighbors about the house. However, their reactions were quite strange. Some refused to answer, even avoiding his eyes when he mentioned the house. An old lady who lived not far away said that the house still remembered. With a deep voice and a distant gaze, the old lady's words made Mark feel cold, as if the house had its own memories, and he was just a witness who had accidentally entered that world. Another night, as it was pouring rain, Mark heard the faint whispering again. This time, the voice was clearer, like someone crying, lingering over the howling wind. He felt he could no longer ignore the unusual signs. A few days after the nightmares began, Mark became more and more worried as the dreams became more vivid and clear. Over the next few nights, Mark dreamed repeatedly of the young girl running away, her face full of fear and her eyes filled with panic. One night, He saw her standing at the end of the hallway, her eyes staring blankly at him, and when he tried to move forward, she suddenly let out a scream that echoed throughout the house, waking him up with a pounding heart. Another time, Mark found himself standing in front of his bedroom door, watching the girl crouching down, as if searching for something under the bed. When he called out, the girl looked up, her face pale and her eyes empty, her lips moving as if she wanted to say something but couldn't make a sound. This time, Mark woke up with a feeling of extreme fear, as if those dreams were not just hallucinations but a warning from the underworld. The supernatural phenomena in the house gradually became more intense, from furniture moving on its own to strange marks appearing on the walls and floors. One night, when Mark went to the kitchen to get water, he found all the drawers wide open, as if someone had rummaged through every corner. As he closed each cabinet door, he suddenly heard slow footsteps coming from the living room. The feeling of being watched made Mark shiver, but he decided to take a closer look. When he entered the living room, he saw that the sofa had moved a few centimeters, as if someone had just sat down and left. The footsteps seemed to be just a reminder that he was not alone. Mark began to doubt himself. Was he imagining all this? However, the signs became more and more obvious and undeniable. When he tried to take a closer look, he saw faint fingerprint-like stains on the wall. The fingerprints were small in shape and size, as if they belonged to a young girl. A feeling of dread gradually took over his mind. This time, Mark decided to ask more neighbors about the house, hoping to find out something clearer. When mentioning the house, most people just shook their heads or changed the subject. An old lady who lived nearby even advised him to leave early, saying, "The people in that house have never been released." A middle-aged man, after a few drinks, began to tell a story about a tragedy that had happened in this house many years ago. A young girl lived there and was betrayed by her lover. It was rumored that she committed suicide out of grief, but some suspected that she was murdered and her death was never cleared up. Mark returned home feeling uneasy. The vague accounts of the girl's unjust death made him even more uneasy, especially as the supernatural signs became clearer and more frequent. Mark began to realize that he was no longer just a tenant. Something seemed to be connecting him to the dead girl, a strange and haunting connection. In the following nights, he heard more whispering, sometimes sobbing echoing in the empty rooms, other times a gentle knocking on the door in the middle of the night. He could no longer sleep. The dreams kept haunting and lingering, making him feel tired and depressed. Every time he closed his eyes, Mark saw the girl's figure appear, as if her soul was still alive and wanted to tell him something. More and more, he felt like he was carrying her grievances on his shoulders, and that soul would not let him go until she found freedom. These supernatural events reached a point where they could not be explained by normal logic. One night, when Mark was lying in the dark, he felt something lightly touching his arm. When he opened his eyes, he saw red bruises on his arm, as if a hand had squeezed it. The extreme fear made him decide to clarify what was really going on. Curiosity and fear prompted Mark to begin investigating the house's past. He stopped by the town library and searched for records related to the address, hoping to find some information about the person who had lived there. After hours of digging through old newspapers, Mark found a small article published exactly 60 years ago, mentioning a tragic incident. The article mentioned a young woman named Julia, who had lived in the house and died under suspicious circumstances. The brief article simply mentioned that Julia had been found dead in her bedroom, with the cause of death being reported as suicide. However, the last few lines of the article sent a chill down Mark's spine. Locals believe that her death was suspicious. Many believe that she was driven to the brink of death and that her death was just a cover-up. Mark felt a heavy heart. This was more than a simple suicide. There seemed to be something very dark lurking behind Julia's death. He wondered if the girl's spirit was haunting the house, trying to find someone to tell the long-buried truth. Mark couldn't stop after learning about Julia's death. He started talking to the elders in town who might remember the event. An elderly woman, after hearing Mark mention Julia's name, sighed and said, "That poor girl. She used to be gentle and kind. Everyone loved her, but I heard that she suffered because of love." The old woman said that Julia had once had a love affair with a rich young man in town. But the young man's family did not accept her because of their social class differences. It seemed that Julia had endured a lot of pressure and contempt, leading to extreme despair. After Julia's death, rumors about her being treated unfairly increased, but no one dared to speak the truth. After hearing this story, Mark felt heavy. This story seemed to open up another aspect of Julia's death. He wondered if the girl's soul was still lingering in this house, unable to move on because of the injustice in his heart. In the following nights, Mark clearly felt the presence of a suffering soul clinging to him. The dreams not only returned, but also became clearer and more painful. In one dream, he saw Julia standing in the middle of a dark room, her face pale and her eyes filled with tears. She tried to say something to Mark, but her voice was muffled. Her feelings of pain and resentment were transmitted to him. As if he could feel Julia's despair, Mark gradually realizes that he is no longer just a tenant. He is caught in a spiral of pain and resentment of a deceased person. Julia's spirit seems to be relying on him to help her find freedom. The hauntings and strange phenomena appear more and more, urging him to clarify everything, to restore peace to the young girl. After learning about the mystery of Julia's death, Mark tries to search through old documents in the house, hoping to find any clues that Julia may have left behind. He finds a small box hidden under the bed. Inside are old letters and Julia's diary. The letters are broken pieces of paper, but contain the sincere feelings of a girl in love, but torn between love and pressure from society. In the diary, Julia wrote about her last days. She describes the pain of rejection, the insults she heard from her lover's family, and the loneliness of the whole town turning its back on her. The diary also reveals that on the last night, Julia saw her lover for the last time. However, her last words were interrupted, as if she did not have time to finish her last words. Mark understands that Julia suffered a lot and probably did not intend to commit suicide. These diary entries are like a cry for help that no one has ever heard. This makes him even more determined to help Julia's soul find peace, so that she will no longer haunt this house. After discovering Julia's letters and diary, Mark feels that things seem to be getting worse. The supernatural phenomena are no longer just vague signs, but now they have become strong and clear, as if Julia's soul is exploding with anger and despair. Early in the morning, when Mark woke up, he noticed red bruises on his wrists and arms, as if someone had held him in his sleep. One night, while Mark was sitting in the living room, he heard a gentle knock on the door. But when he opened the door, it was completely empty. The knocking kept repeating, more and more urgent, as if someone was desperate to get into the house. Mark felt so scared that he wanted to leave immediately, but it seemed like there was an invisible attraction holding him back, forcing him to witness everything. On a moonlit night, when the space was completely silent, Mark felt a strange attraction pulling him towards the bedroom. As soon as he entered the room, a chill ran down his spine, and the light of the night light flickered, gradually fading until the bedroom was plunged into darkness. Suddenly, Mark found himself standing in the middle of the dark room, and in front of him, Julia's figure appeared clearly. She wore a white dress, her face pale, her eyes red as if she had cried her eyes out. Mark felt unable to move, unable to turn away, as if bound to her resentful and desperate gaze. In a magical moment, Mark saw Julia's last memories like a movie playing back. He saw Julia being dragged, oppressed by the loved ones of the boy she once loved. They forced her to give up her love, forcing her into a situation with no way out. And in the moment she breathed her last, the resentment bound her soul to this house. Mark realized that all the supernatural events were Julia's pleas, as if she wanted him to help her find the release she never had. He saw Julia's anger, her resentment like a raging storm, swirling around him and weighing heavily on his mind. He was not only a witness to her pain, but also a bridge that helped her speak the truth that had been buried for the past 60 years. After understanding the whole tragedy, Mark felt a deep sense of responsibility. Julia's soul not only needed to be known to the world, but also needed justice, an explanation for everything. The strange phenomena were no longer scary, but became a cry for help from a trapped soul, wishing to escape the shackles of the past. Just when Mark thought everything was gradually becoming clear, The supernatural phenomena reached their peak. Late one night, when everything was quiet, the house suddenly shook. The doors opened and slammed shut continuously. Julia's cries echoed in the space. Her desperate screams seemed to pierce Mark's mind, making him dizzy and fall to the floor. Suddenly, the large mirror in the room shattered, pieces of glass flying everywhere. For a terrifying moment, Mark saw Julia's image through the shards of glass, her face filled with despair, and he clearly heard her whisper, "Help me." The room was dark, without a single ray of light. Mark heard someone's heavy footsteps approaching and felt a cold hand on his shoulder. His heart felt like it was about to jump out of his chest, but he understood that it was Julia, begging him to help her escape this invisible obsession. After the terrifying experiences, Mark felt he could no longer ignore Julia's soul's pleas. He was determined to seek justice for her, to help her soul be freed from pain and resentment. He began his investigation again, this time focusing on finding people related to Julia's story from years ago. Mark returned to the library, following the records of Julia's ex-lover's family, who had been banned by the boy's family. He discovered that the family was a wealthy and powerful family in town at that time. Using the old address he found from the archives, Mark was able to locate the family's house. With determination, Mark went to the old house of Julia's lover's family. He found an old man, who was the cousin of Julia's ex-lover. At first, the old man seemed reluctant to talk about the past, but when Mark mentioned the details of Julia's death, the old man seemed to waver. After much pleading, the old man finally agreed to tell the story of the past. The old man said that at that time, their family strongly opposed the relationship between Julia and the young man because her family was not of equal social status. In a fit of anger, his family forced Julia to break off the relationship. However, the young man continued to secretly meet her, leading to many arguments and conflicts. Her family members pressured her to leave the boy, and on the last night she saw him, the family followed her and brutally dragged her out of his house. That was the last time they saw Julia alive. The old man also said that there were suspicions in the family that Julia's death was not a suicide but a consequence of the oppression and threats she had suffered. However, the family concealed the truth and kept everything quiet in order to avoid a scandal that could ruin their reputation. Mark listened to the story with indignation and understood that Julia had been pushed into despair by the very people who did not accept her love. After the conversation, Mark returned home and felt Julia's presence more strongly than ever. It seemed that her spirit had witnessed everything and realized that her story had been told. However, the resentment was still not resolved. Mark knew that in order for her to be truly at peace, he needed to make the truth about Julia's death public so that everyone in town would understand her tragedy. Mark decided to write an article, telling Julia's story in detail and fairly, clearly stating the truth he had found. He sent the article to a local news site, hoping that someone would read it and sympathize with Julia's story. This was the only way he could help her find peace. When the whole truth was revealed, Mark wrote in the article that Julia did not commit suicide, but was a victim of social oppression, the cruelty of her lover's family, and the prejudices of the time. With the evidence he collected, he told Julia's painful story, from her hopeful first love to her unjust death. Mark hoped that through this story, everyone could understand and sympathize with the young girl who had to endure so much pain that she could not escape. After sending the article, Mark felt relieved, as if he had fulfilled his responsibility to Julia's soul. That night, he heard a soft whisper in his ear, her familiar voice, "Thank you." The house became peaceful. No more footsteps, no more terrifying darkness and nightmares. Mark felt that Julia had been freed, and she had finally found the peace she had longed for. That night, he slept peacefully after many nights of nightmares. After Julia's story was made public on the local news site, Mark felt relieved. The supernatural phenomena in the house gradually disappeared. No more crying, no more whispering, and no more mysterious figures appearing in the darkness. However, Mark knew that perhaps he would have one last time to face Julia's spirit. That night, when everything became quiet, Mark sat in the living room, waiting for a sign from her. Suddenly, the light in the room dimmed, and Mark felt a cold air spread. Before him, Julia's figure appeared, blurry but filled with relief, no longer filled with hatred and despair. This time Julia looked at him with gentle and grateful eyes. In a moment, without words, Mark understood that she had found peace thanks to his actions. The secrets had been revealed. Her grievances had been cleared up, and now she could leave this world peacefully. As Julia's figure gradually disappeared, Mark felt a gentle breeze, as if her soul was slowly dissolving into the air, blending with the light that Mark was gradually revealing outside. The house became warmer and brighter, no longer gloomy and heavy as before. Mark felt like this house was finally freed from the haunting darkness that had haunted it for so long. To complete everything, Mark performed a small ritual, burning incense and praying for Julia, hoping that she could find peace elsewhere. The house had now become a quiet and peaceful place, no longer the haunted house like the first day he moved in. Mark decided to leave the house after everything was done. Before leaving, he stood one last time in front of the room where Julia often appeared, looking around and recalling all the scary but also humane experiences he had gone through. The sense of loss was fleeting, but Mark knew he had done what was necessary to help a soul find rest. As he left the house, Mark turned back and looked at the house one last time. A sense of peace and satisfaction filled his heart, as if he had not only helped Julia rest in peace, but also helped himself find peace after a long time of haunting. Mark left town, carrying Julia's story with him as an unforgettable memory. The mysterious experiences at the house changed the way he viewed life, the strange things that science could not explain, and the compassion between humans and the spirit world. He realized that sometimes, wandering souls were just suffering people looking for justice, a release from the pain they had endured. After returning to the city, Mark decided to rewrite his entire story and share it with more people. He did not want the truth about Julia to be forgotten, so that her story would become a lesson about love, resentment, and compassion for souls who have not yet been released. Mark hopes that through this story, people can better understand and sympathize with the mysteries in life that we sometimes do not fully understand.